Hello and welcome to Living with the Lectionary. It's a weekly podcast ministry from Palmacia Presbyterian Church in Tampa, Florida. It's a weekly recording where pastors and lay people gather together each week to consider and reflect the gospel lectionary reading for the coming Sunday. Our typical pattern is that one of us serves as the facilitator and drafts questions for the others to use for exploration and reflection. This week, I am serving as facilitator. And we gather together once a week to talk about the passage in light of those questions. And today, it's my joy to be joined by...
I'm Kenny Hubbell, and I'm recording from my kitchen in Tampa, Florida.
And we miss Bill this morning. Apparently, his cable provider is doing a major upgrade, and that has eliminated him from having access to the internet. So, Bill, we miss you, and thank you for letting us know. And I hope you're back up and running in no time. I am Sara Mickelson, and I'm one of the members at Palmacia Presbyterian Church in Tampa, and I'm recording from Tampa. And as we continue our exploration of year C, and we're coming to a close quickly, we're looking at Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. This continues our story about things in Luke that turn things on its ear, so to speak. And this gospel lectionary reading is for the coming Sunday, November 2nd. And since we will be working with holy things, it feels appropriate to pray. So if you'll join me for a moment, we'll give God a conversation invitation. Holy and most gracious God, come to us. Stand with us. Bring understanding to our heads and our hearts. And be with the people in people in Jamaica who are facing Hurricane Melissa this morning. Thank you, and amen. So I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass by that way. And when Jesus came to that place, he looked up and he said, "Zacchaeus, hurry, come down. I must stay at your house today." And so he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. And all who saw him began to grumble. And he said, "He's gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." And Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay them back 4 times as much." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to your house, because he too is the son of Abraham. And for the Son of Man has come to seek out and save the lost." So my questions stem from assumptions, and what assumptions are made in this story and while reading this story. So what assumptions were made by the people listening to Jesus at the time, or hearing Luke's writings, or reading them now? And how does Jesus flip that script? Ken, I'm coming to you first.
Each question you can just come to me. So Sarah, it's interesting. This morning, I'm thinking about this passage, and I almost thought the parable of Zacchaeus, and I was like, oh wait, no, this is not a parable. This is Jesus' active ministry walking. But the fact that it feels like a parable, because in the parable there's sort of this intentional, you're going to expect something and it's going to be different, but that's the assumption you're talking about, and that's how I travel through this text the same way. There's these assumptions of all the characters in the story, and Jesus indeed flips the script like he would in a parable to change our expectations, to catch our attention, but this is simply lived out. And I sort of broke it down, excuse me, broke it down by the character. So Zacchaeus' assumption is that he wouldn't be seen. He's probably standing a little, yes, in the tree, but probably behind the crowd. And I don't think he's expecting any sort of direct attention from Jesus. There's the crowd's expectation that certainly Jesus wouldn't befriend this man, even if he does engage him. There's the expectation of, or the assumption of Jesus that this tax collector will indeed host him, that he will be responsive to this request to have dinner at his home. And then maybe for the reader or the crowd or those engaging with this text, the assumption is that the change of behavior would precede Jesus's care. Because I think for many of us, that feels like, well, that's justice. That's what's fair. The man shows that he's worthy of Jesus's positive attention, worthy of that salvation. And Jesus is, that's just not how he's responding. He's moving towards this man in friendship prior to any change in behavior. And that's maybe the central flip of the script, that Jesus would open up this door to friendship prior to this chief tax collector changing his ways and making these statements and declarations of all the things that he's going to give back if he is taken from people, which he probably did. Just a fascinating classic Jesus moment in that very surprising behavior.
I'm going to add that first, the story of Zacchaeus is a tender story. And to me, I express that because I think I was taught this story early in my experience. I think this is a Mrs. Pooley story. And Mrs. Pooley was my Sunday school teacher before I was 5. So Mrs. Pooley would often have all the little kids in one room. And I was definitely one of those, like stand on a pew little, because I couldn't see. And I for some reason resonated with this idea that being little and not being able to see was not a showstopper for being in the conversation about Jesus. And so that's my connection to this story is I felt like I was like Zacchaeus. And I remember singing this song, a wee little man, you'd get down on your knees like wee little man was he. And so I remember all of these wonderful methods we have of imparting the stories of Jesus to children. And I think when I first heard the story, I thought he was short. I thought he was a really short person. And that's why he got in the tree. There are a lot of things that I wrap around the story. I think that we make assumptions about people by what they do for a living. I think we make assumptions about people because of their height. I think we make assumptions about people if they have wealth. I think we make assumptions about people if they're associated to others who we find unacceptable or admirable. I think it goes both ways. So I like that Jesus invites us into a conversation with, or I should say an interrogation with this passage that helps us kind of break through those assumptions. So I think Jesus flips the script on us a bit. And I think this is a continuation of the stories that he's been telling us in Luke that have invited us to consider that those who always look like they're perfect or holy may not be. And those who look unacceptable or dangerous or sick may not be entirely unholy. And I think that's interesting. And I think that our perception, our visual perception, overrules a lot of things that we would have normally asked more questions about. And we pass people by. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting about Zacchaeus, is he was not someone you would admire at that time. And I think it follows on the heels of the disciples asking the question, after the rich young ruler comes, after the Pharisee is seen to be less than in his prayer with the tax collector last week, after the rich young ruler is unable to find salvation, they ask the question, well, who then can be saved? And I think Jesus and Zacchaeus give us that very interesting perspective. And Jesus goes, this man can be saved. So I like all of those things that Jesus flips, and that Jesus goes, but the heart is really what's valuable here. And that's not really said in this story, but it's implied. So that's kind of interesting for me. I'm also not sure if short in stature is only about height. And so maybe that's the other piece of this puzzle is who is short in stature to me might not be who is short in stature to God.
Mm.
And I think that's valuable for all of us to bear witness and to acknowledge, and perhaps even to be surprised by. My second question is, how does Zacchaeus live into the meaning of his name? And Ken, I'll come back to you for that.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm now Kenny Hubbell, and I'm recording from my bedroom as my 2-year-old kicked me out of the kitchen. Um, it's interesting as you're speaking, and we'll get to the second question, but I'm looking up his name in the interlinear, and the Greek word for um, little, small, mikros, is also least and insignificant. And so there is some curiosity here in terms of what is small in stature meaning in this moment. Um, though it seems like the consensus of the church and the tradition is short because we have so much imagery and song about Zacchaeus being this way. Um, Zacchaeus, his name meaning pure innocent, is the name that I came up with. Is that the same meaning of the name? That's really fascinating, and I had never looked up his name. Um, it's I wonder if how we understand purity or innocence is so seen through like our sense of justice, how we define what is fair and right, and we are a really um, we're a pretty judgmental people. I'd say that about humanity, but our cultural context, we're very comfortable with making quick judgments, not knowing the hearts of people. And we have a lot of different lenses in which we use to justify our judgments. And the people of um, that time and that place would look at a chief tax collector, and the assumption would be he has betrayed all his people and that he's a wicked man. And his name, meaning pure or innocent, he certainly is found that way in the end of the story. There's a purifying moment. There is a he, Zacchaeus's willingness to then give back more than he took. There's sort of if there is guilt, there's an alleviation of that guilt, like justice is sort of found in him. Um, and maybe that's where our attention should go, is like not we're not just like a sum total of our bad decisions. Thank the Lord that we are not just a sum total of our bad decisions, but we have capacity, and we are transformed, and we can get through some of those rougher edges and find ourselves in a different state of being, largely by the grace of God. And so Zacchaeus, pure and innocent Zacchaeus, uh, that seems to be how Jesus approaches him in the beginning. That Jesus is not contending with the rougher edges of him, but sees the man, befriends the man, and it's in this exchange that there there might be elements of purity and innocence retained. Um, but it's an interesting abstraction here, and I think probably an intentional name. There's plenty of stories where we don't get the person's name, a man, a woman. Zacchaeus is named, and I think that must be intentional. What do you think, Sarah? Let me flip it back to you.
Well, I my I guess my question would be, is this just an irony? Is this a comparison or a contrast to behavior and then authenticity of the Spirit? And so I don't know. But it made me ask the question, what about him is pure and righteous? Um, his desire to see Jesus, certainly. The language that's used and the way that the original text reads as before it's translated, according to Mark Davis, there's some beautiful things here. To run into the before is this idea of, I'm thinking about who was he before, and now he's this. And so it's almost like he's running into who he was before his life took this turn and he became a tax collector. So, or he became who people perceive him to be. So there's this invitation to explore that notion of who are we before we begin? And God sees us and loves us in that capacity. So there's something lovely about those words. Certainly his clarity to intentionality, climb the tree, to let go of the dignity of what people would think and just climb the tree because he is intent on seeing Jesus. There's something lovely and very pure about that. His focused ability to let go of the gossip around him. I don't know that the rest of us are strong like that. And can say, no, I know this is what I do for a living, and I am not that. And I'm thinking about those people who have jobs that are perceived as undesirable in our culture, and the job is to do your job and to do it to the best of your ability. That's really kind of, I guess, the way my Christian faith would invite me to do what work I am doing. So his unshakable defense of his job, and perhaps even holding those who worked with him to that same level of accountability. That's interesting to me from a tax collector's perspective. Zacchaeus lifts himself to see the exalted one. I don't know that I'd have that confidence. That's an interesting place to be, to invite, like jumping up and down in the back of the room going, God, I'm here. Here I am. I want to see you. And inviting that kind of attention. I think I would be much more intimidated knowing who I was going to see. So I kind of like this idea that we're invited to explore this irony of who this person is. I will also say, in Mark Davis's blog about this, he does this great exegesis on the original text and says, Zacchaeus' reparations and his conversation about what he does are talked about in the present tense. Not like I'm going to do these things. It's I am doing these things. This is what I do. And so there's this interesting turn of a thought that maybe the way he operates as a tax collector is not the expected way. And that he says, if I defraud, I refund or I make reparation 4 times more, 4 times in return, which is not according to Levitican law, is even more than that. Levitican law would only require 3 times. So it's that perspective of maybe he's not who we assume he is. So I kind of like this idea. And he doesn't ask Jesus to come to his house. Jesus goes, I'm going to come to your house and eat. And my first thought now that I'm a grown-up is, oh my gosh, I got a clean house. And so Jesus comes to his house, and it's just this great idea. And that leads me to my third question. This notion of homecoming and salvation are presented in the same breath, and in the story. And I guess my question is why? Why is Zacchaeus saved? And how might that inform today us? How do we live with that? How do we understand that? And how do we come around to digging deeper into that? What are your thoughts, Ken?
Well, Sarah, thanks. I find myself wanting to keep responding to your answers because they're so good, and they're so thorough and interesting. I I, I find myself thinking, I wish Jesus would have elaborated. I wish Luke would have elaborated on the story some, because we are left with some kind of questions grammatically, and being like, what was he doing this? Was he at this? Is this a tax collector of a different kind? And this is why, and Jesus knows this, but people's assumptions are wrong. And this whole story is much more about Zacchaeus. Like, Zacchaeus is a upstanding citizen, and he's been the model tax collector. Is that true? And Jesus is trying to shed light on being like, you all don't know this man. There'd be such engaging teaching that would come from that notion. Or is this tax collector finding himself in the moment of repentance, and we're seeing that sort of transformative? There's those questions, and maybe Luke is very fine with us just living in the tension of that and being like, um, or is it just not really even about Zacchaeus? And it's just about who Jesus is and what Jesus is doing. And Zacchaeus just happens to be the man with a particular profession who found himself in a tree. And it was much more important for early Christian readers to hear about how Jesus operates. Um, Probably a combination of all of that. For for us in this question, why is Zacchaeus saved, and how might that inform followers today? I just keep coming back to, it's Jesus who ushers it in. This is not about behavior. This is not about what Zacchaeus was doing before this encounter, or what Zacchaeus will even do after this encounter. Salvation, I think this is sort of the microcosm of the gospel, comes towards us because of Jesus's will, God's will. It's not our doing, it's not our work. And that is, I think, always a hurdle in the Christian faith, where we want it to look like justice. We struggle for us to receive it as grace, meaning we think we have to get right with God so that we can get right with God. And which is why, if we're in a season of struggle and we feel guilty and ashamed, we will turn away from God typically. We'll have a harder time going towards God. We want to go to God with a good report card. We want to go to God with like a, hey, God, look at, I'm doing these things right. We want to become Pharisees. We want to be able to show God, hey, I'm doing the right things. Therefore, I have now earned it, which is justice. That's fairness that we're describing. If we live in a way that just looks fully righteous, and we can say and report back to God, I've done X, Y, and Z the ways that you've told me to. I read my Bible. I've seen the laws. I'm doing that work. So now I receive the good thing that I worked towards, because that's how we operate. It's not how God operates. God says, you can't work your way to this. In fact, Jesus is like, I'm going to keep raising the bar because you knuckleheads don't realize that you're already failing and you cannot earn this. And I'm going to just give it to you, because that's the gracious act, because the desire is you and your heart. It's not all what you can produce. This is kind of the faith versus works dialogue reworked in a story. And it's not to say that works aren't important. I imagine it gives Jesus in this moment joy to hear that Zacchaeus is doing this, that he's becoming gracious, whether that's because of who he is or because of how he's responding to Jesus's invitation to have dinner at his home. The heart of Zacchaeus is pointing outwards towards others, to the benefit of others. That's a good thing. And I imagine Jesus is like, great job. But it's when it comes to the salvation and this home invitation, how this transformation happens in the movement of the Spirit, I think that's about Jesus showing compassion on people, and Jesus ushering in this salvation by relationship, by befriending, coming to your home for dinner. And I'm like you, I'm stressed because I need to tidy up if I'm going to have the Son of God over. But there's a lot of meat on this bone. I find myself wanting to stay pretty Jesus centric on this one.
It's a fun place to walk between what might be, what is, and what we don't know, especially in this story. Um, so for me, I kind of explored the physicality of it. Jericho is a place where, when moving from Jerusalem to Jericho, a certain person was beaten half to death and left on the side of the road, and people stopped to take care of him, and the people that stopped to take care of him were the unexpected. The Pharisee didn't stop. The other people, the rich people, didn't stop. And yet Jericho is also the home of Rahab, and Rahab had a bad rap too. And she was the one that welcomed the spies in, gave them a place of shelter in the book of Joshua. And she was protected from the destruction of the city because of that, and became a fine practitioner of the Jewish faith with the people of Israel. So it's interesting, and she's listed, I think, in the lineage of Jesus. Am I right? Am I right? I don't know. But it's an interesting perspective about Jericho, and now we have Zacchaeus there. Now, I will also volunteer that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and Jericho's not far. So all of that being what it is, and the word homecoming weaving itself into this story is interesting to me. Jericho seems to be a place where salvation comes to the homes of sinners who were thought to be unredeemable. Perhaps homecoming is the action of moving from who you were thought to be into who you were created to be. Sinners are a priority for Jesus, and finding the lost is certainly an example of that. And Zacchaeus is found. It's interesting to me that, like the coin, like the sheep, Zacchaeus has taken steps toward looking for Jesus. He wants just to see him. But he is found by Jesus and reclaimed as family, which is yet another homecoming, to be wrapped again in who you are and who you were created to be. So I like this whole idea of homecoming being a recognition of where did your roots start? Where do you when you think of home, where is home? What is home? And why is it home? And I think that's part of the beautiful part of the story for me is Zacchaeus is enveloped in home because Jesus is coming there. And so maybe there's some notion there that home is where Jesus is, and not necessarily home being where my feet are or where I remember home being before. Maybe home is where Jesus is. So that was kind of a neat idea for me. I do note that Zacchaeus moves toward Jesus. So there's this movement ahead of time that's already taken place. Or I should say, this curiosity is driving Zacchaeus to see Jesus. And that the salvation arrives before Jesus has dinner. Salvation arrives before we get to the house, almost. At least that's a really good question. I think that I would like to explore that deeper and understand better. At what point does salvation occur? And I don't know. I don't know that we have a clean line in the sand that said it was 3 minutes past 7, and it was just as he came down from the tree before they even got to the house. Or is it in the conversation? Or is it the delight that I think the other thing is the word rejoicing that's used, that Zacchaeus rejoices, is the same language that's used when the shepherd finds the sheep and when the sinner is redeemed in heaven. That the angels rejoice when someone is saved or found. So I like the idea of that we can touch that joy in the same way. So that's what I got.
I don't have a clear cut answer either of when salvation comes. So I'm fascinated with the healing stories of Jesus. Often they move from the healing And then Jesus says, now go leave your life of sin. And it's to say that the healing comes before the behavioral modification,
Yeah.
before the changes that might be needed to make. And I'm always really engaged with how that's again an example of we get right with God once grace appears, and so then we are compelled by gratitude for that mercy, for that grace, for that forgiveness, for that healing. And the trajectory is like what is the impetus? It's gratitude. Thank you, Lord, for having mercy on me, a sinner. Versus the opposite side of that is I need to go change my life because God is mad at me and I don't want consequence. And if that's compelling you, you're compelled by fear. And our conception of God is that of wrathful God. And the Christian spectrum houses a lot of that theology. And it's one I'm weary of because I think the gospel narrative is that of Jesus compelling people to move towards God because God is good and there's things to be grateful for and there's healing to be had versus Jesus running around with a whip, which is the alternative perspective. And we have to kind of contend with that. And we, because of our sort of punitive understanding of justice, we run up against this probably more than we realize, even if we find ourselves in the theological leaning of thinking, of course we just move with gratitude. Um, it's just tricky terrain as we try
Yeah.
to manage it.
Well, and I think oftentimes it's shame that keeps us from coming to God.
Mhm.
I'm thinking of the Adam and Eve moment where, oh Lord, we're naked. And, all of a sudden, that? And I'm like, you didn't know that before? And so now the shame of doing something that we know broke God's heart keeps us from him.
Yeah, the hiding and thinking that we need to hide. And once I can remedy it on my own, once I can make clothes, then I can be in God's presence again.
Right.
And it's this idea of we have to get right before we get right before God. And
But I also think, going back to your conversation around our, if our worst choices are the things that people see and know about us, how do we, how do we come around that? How do we move past that? There's any number of wonderful literature pieces that talk about turns of heart and that the turn of heart happens before the turn of opinion and or before the marketing material arrives. And so it's kind of like God already has that well in hand. um, and even the conversations around evil, that that although we feel the presence of evil, there's nothing that's beyond the reach of God.
mm,
And I think that that's important to hear when you're feeling on the outside of it, when you feel disconnected from God, when you are in search of Jesus, if you will, and a good sycamore tree to climb. So that perspective of I've got to be further away, I don't need to get in the middle of things, I just want to see, reminds me of the woman that just wants to touch the hem of the garment.
mm,
Reminds me of the I'm not worthy, you don't need to come to my house, just say the word and my daughter will be healed moment with the centurion. I understand how authority works. So it's this wonderful perspective of um, the reach of God is, there's nothing beyond the reach of God. And I think that that's helpful, especially to people who are feeling
yeah.
that distance or that gap. Um,
And we
I
see
think,
that in the positive in those examples throughout, and we also see it in the negative of the prophets not being accepted in their hometown.
yeah,
It was a terrifying thought after getting out of college, the possibility of returning to my hometown to do ministry, where everyone's going to perceive me as high school Kenny, and that's I don't think the fullest or truest version of myself. That's a particular moment, middle adolescence, where you make the dumbest decisions and your brain isn't fully formed. But there's people whose perceptions of me would be so solidified in that, where the idea of doing what I'm doing here in Tampa seemed out of reach because of that, because of the grumblings of the crowd, the opinions of the people, because the heart was changed and the trajectory was set for a life of ministry. But to do that in my hometown just didn't seem feasible because of a past, a complicated one, and I wasn't some I wasn't in the news. It wasn't like my mistakes as a high schooler were something significant, or I didn't have any sort of tax collector-esque reputation. But just the nature of people is to say, no, no, your history ties to your identity, and I think there's places in this story to try to unburden people with their history. And we all need that. We all need some untethering from what came before, and for people to see who we are now. That I think that would be liberating if a community could say, you know what, I've had opinions on this person in this room, maybe, in church, whatever, because 20 years ago, what does 20 years have to do with who this person sitting here is now? Because I don't know any person who travels to 20 years time and is the exact same person.
Yeah.
In fact, I think life and all its experiences are going to inform that person's change, and we'd probably be benefiting from a more gracious standpoint. It'd probably be better if we could have a more general curiosity. Oh, I wonder if that person's changed, and if that is our mindset, I think we might be slower to judgment and probably a little more gracious.
With ourselves too, I think.
Hmm.
Um, so I like this story a lot. I'm glad that we read it. I'm glad that I wish we read it more often. Um, and I'm thinking about central casting and who I would put into the role of Zacchaeus today if I were to cast this. Um, and would I intentionally pick somebody who others see as short?
Mm.
I don't know. I'm torn. There's a number of wonderful films out there that have um, themes like this, like Spitfire Grill, which is something pretty old, but was initially funded as a startup film through Sundance. One of the original pieces, and it's about a young girl who, for whatever reason, participates in a writing contest. The owner of the Spitfire Grill goes to or says, that she's going to give away the grill to somebody who can write an essay as to why she needs the grill. And she only opens the essay program to, I don't know, maybe it's not restricted, but the woman that wins it, the woman that writes this essay, is coming out of prison. And so this is real challenge in this little community that she's going to be the new Spitfire Grill owner. But it's this beautiful story. Um, and it's about healing, and it's about redemption, and it's about possibility, and it's about what family means, and it's about homecoming. So it's got all the same notes in it that the story of Zacchaeus does. There's a wonderful animated film called Klaus, Klaus. One best animated film a couple of years ago at the Oscars. It's a wonderful story, Christmas story, maybe available soon on Netflix or Amazon Prime, might be Apple TV. I don't know. Anyway, I think I found it on Netflix. I highly recommend that because it paints the story of who we think somebody are, and really challenges us to let go of who we think they are. And it's a wonderful, beautiful animation. You probably have seen it already.
I can recall it playing in the background. I
Yeah.
find myself thinking I've seen a movie and realizing, no, my children saw a movie that did dishes during, or something like that. So I feel like I've seen bits and pieces of Claus, and though I can remember Bennett enjoying it. That's what I remember.
I can tell you the soundtracks to so many films that I have sat in the front seat of a car and listened to
Hmm.
while my children were in the back seat watching. So it's this interesting, I can tell you the dialogue more than I can tell you what the film looked like. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that we had this opportunity to talk about Zacchaeus and want to be mindful of your day. Bonus question. Any other questions you would ask about this?
Only thing I'm wondering about, and I have a reason to wonder about it. How old do you think Zacchaeus is? He's the chief tax collector, which it's a senior position, and so I don't think he's some young buck just getting into the tax collecting game.
Mm-mm.
He's had to have been around for some amount of time. But what's your best guess?
Life expectancy at this time for a man?
Well, 55.
40, 50. I'm gonna
Yeah.
guess. I'm gonna guess that let's make him 45.
I'm thinking if he's in his 40s, which is maybe a reasonable guess. I'm daunted at the idea of climbing a tree right now. I'm turning 36 next month, and I feel like that would be an irresponsible
Yeah.
decision for me to climb a tree of any height because that just is that's just asking for trouble. And if I think about this senior tax collector who's in his 40s, let's say, running ahead of the crowd to then climb up a tree, um, I I don't care if that's the spryest 40-some-year-old person. That just seems like a tall order. And I think contextualizes the story in an interesting way. I see children climbing trees in the courtyard of the church all the time, and
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, of course they can. They're made of jelly, and if and they can get around those limbs no problem. But for me to try to do that on any height, the sycamore tree has these thick trunkish branches that kind of hang low, and so it's not like he's climbing a big oak and he's up 12 feet. It's probably like he's up 2 feet. But to even just step up into that tree is one that I'm like, I'm not. If I see folks in their 40s doing that in the courtyard, I'm like, hey, what are you doing? Be more careful. It's a liability issue, and that's I just for me, it's kind of a funny part of this story of trying to envisioning someone not a child climbing a tree is fascinating.
Well, I wondered who you'd climb a tree for. That was my one of my questions is who would we climb a tree for? I don't know that there's an answer. Um, and and
See,
the
I'm
other thing
tall.
pardon
I
me,
can see over the. I'm tall. I can see over probably most crowds.
your height advantaged.
I am. That's true.
Um, and the other thing is who in our world is a Zacchaeus? And those are I'm not sure those are and questions we should answer. Um, but I think oftentimes we trap people into their worst day. Um, the groundhog
I
event.
that's my inclination is to answer that question saying we've all been Zacchaeus.
Mhm.
We've all been the crowd. We grumbling that Jesus goes over.
Yeah.
The person or the people that you have a hard time loving, that's Zacchaeus. And you're grumbling about God's grace reaching out to them too, because you know their heart and you know their history. And that could have so many different affiliations. That could be like that Betty Lou who was so mean to me in middle school, whatever it was. Or it's like that the refugees of a kind, or those of a political affiliation,
Yeah.
the opposite party. Whoever we want to say, I don't think that they should receive God's love and grace. We are putting people up on that sycamore tree. I think that's kind of the tension that we should interact with
That's an
is
interesting turn of phrase, put up on a tree.
and there's a long dark history of what that can look like,
Yeah.
and even
Yeah.
um, our Lenten songs and Good Friday of putting Christ up on that tree. And yeah, we have to, I think, encounter in the story um, a disagreeable salvation. Uh, uh, we always struggle with the fact that we are all God's children
Yeah.
because we're so tempted to just other people. That they are in a category of not worthy. They are in a category of this is why all of the biggest atrocities of human history starts with dehumanizing. They are not people. And when we see that throughout history, and any language that dehumanizes is really dangerous because it puts people in this perspective of like, oh, tax collectors aren't real people. We can disregard tax collectors.
Yeah.
We could punish tax collectors differently because they are not real people.
And we could take that
Anytime,
noun, we could take that noun and just substitute any noun
anything,
that we want.
anything that we want to dehumanize,
Yeah.
uh, it's really we got to
Heartbreaking.
be careful here. Yeah.
It helped me. Bill Wolof used to say this, and it really helped me that anytime we draw a line in the sand between us and someone else, he goes, I can pretty much guarantee Jesus is on the other side of that line. It was just an interesting idea for me that when we draw walls or circles around ourselves, we're invited to consider that Jesus is on the outside and not on the inside.
There's the story in John's gospel of the woman caught in adultery. I think this is John in the eighth chapter, in the first verses of the eighth chapter. And we see Jesus writing in the sand. We don't see what he's writing, but in terms of drawing a line in the sand, we see Jesus bending down and writing something in the sand. We don't know what it is, but this leads to the cast the first stone if you are not a sinner kind of thing. And I had a theology professor who was kind of one who speculated like what Jesus was drawing and or writing in the sand. And as people were accusing this woman of or she was caught in adultery, and there's an adulterer, he was writing, Solomon lied to his mother, and he was writing down the people in the crowd, their names and their sin. And now that's total speculation. There's no scriptural support of that, but this notion of Jesus is writing something in the sand, and it's compelling the crowd to part and to not move towards stoning this woman caught in
Well,
adultery.
and it's interesting because it doesn't really say where he's standing when he's drawing in the sand. So
Mm,
it's almost like it could be a message to her.
mm-hmm.
Don't panic. It'll be okay.
Yeah.
Stay with me. It'll, it could be a message directly to her. It could be a message pointed at the crowd. We don't know. It's such a beautiful explanation of people are not who we've put them in the box to be, and that there's hope and there's homecoming and
Mm.
there's redemption. All right. Listeners, I hope that these questions and responses might spur in you a desire to dive deeper into what God might be saying to you in this passage. If you have any questions and you would like to share your thoughts, we would love to hear them. You can address your emails to podcast@palmacia.org. We also invite you to visit our website, where you can find out more about the ministry and the mission of Palmacia Presbyterian Church. We'd also like to draw your attention to our sister podcast, The First Look at the Lectionary, which is recorded traditionally on Monday mornings each week and offers a quick first impression of one of the lectionary texts for this coming Sunday. And with that, I will say thank you for joining us, and may your day be filled with Zacchaeus. Take care. God bless.